Where did you get that cloak?
My lord, I found it.
She was warned. Touch nothing in his chamber. But the cloak was on the floor, the Duke was at the door, and her hands were already wrapped around the evidence that would change both their lives forever. If you love royal romance filled with forbidden tension, secrets wrapped in silk, and a love that no crown could contain, then you are in the right place. Subscribe now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that will make your heart race and your breath stop. Now let us begin. The wrong door, the right ruin. Aldermere Voss had survived 4 years in Aldermere Castle by being invisible. Not in the way of ghosts or shadows, though the stone corridors of the castle came close enough to haunt it on winter mornings. She survived by being perfectly, deliberately unremarkable. She pressed her back against walls when footsteps approached. She lowered her gaze when nobility passed. She folded herself into the rhythm of the castle like a note tucked between pages, present but unread. She was 22 years old, a junior chambermaid assigned to the East Wing, born in the village of Haverstone to a blacksmith father and a seamstress mother. She had arrived at Aldermere Castle with a small leather satchel, calloused hands, and a letter of recommendation from the village magistrate that praised her diligence and discretion above everything else. Diligence and discretion. That was all she was supposed to be. And she had been. Until the morning of the 16th of October. The castle was preparing for the arrival of Duke Caspian Aldermere, the Lord of the Northern Territories and the second most powerful man in the kingdom after the king himself. His visits were rare and always preceded by a week of frantic preparation. Floors were polished to mirror surfaces. Silver was rubbed until hands ached. Every maid was assigned a specific corridor, a specific task, a specific room. Under no circumstance was anyone to deviate from their assignment. Aldermere had been assigned the East Corridor, 3rd floor. Her task was straightforward. Change the linens in rooms 12 through 16, dust the window casements, and leave. Simple. Contained. Invisible. But on the morning of the 16th, the housekeeper, a sharp-shouldered woman named Mrs. Hartwell, had made an error in the assignment ledger. A single digit transposed. Room 61 instead of room 16. Aldermere did not realize this until she was already on the West Wing, 6th floor, standing in front of a door she had never opened before, holding a pile of fresh linens that smelled of lavender and pressed starch. The guard stationed outside the door was not there. She would later learn he had stepped away to answer a sudden summons from below stairs. She would later learn that this door, this room, this entire corridor on the 6th floor West Wing was the private chamber of Duke Caspian Aldermere himself. She did not know any of that yet. She pushed the door open. The room was not what she expected. She had cleaned enough noble rooms to know their language. Heavy drapes in predictable colors. Portraits arranged for vanity. furniture chosen to impress visitors rather than comfort inhabitants. But this room was different. It was large, yes, with high ceilings and tall windows that faced the northern hills, but it was also deeply personal in a way that made her feel like an intruder the moment she stepped inside. There were maps on the walls, real maps, not decorative ones, covered in ink notations and marked with colored pins. There was a writing desk beneath the window that was covered in letters and ledgers and what appeared to be a half-finished chess game against an absent opponent. There were books, actual books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages, piled on every flat surface. And there was a faint scent in the room, something between wood smoke and something darker, cedar perhaps, or crushed pine needles from the northern forests the Duke was said to love. Ilara stood still for a moment, uncertain. She turned to leave. That was when the cloak fell. It had been draped over the back of the tall chair near the door, hung carelessly, perhaps in haste. It slipped from the chair and puddled onto the stone floor in a sweep of deep midnight blue wool lined with silver-gray silk. It was a remarkable garment. Even to her untrained eye she could tell it was worth more than her salary for an entire year. The embroidery along the hem was delicate, the kind of work that took months and fingers that rarely slept. She looked at it on the floor. She thought of Mrs. Hartwell's voice during her first week at Aldermere. Maids do not leave things in disorder. Wherever you find something fallen, wherever you find something wrong, you correct it. That is your duty. She bent down and picked it up. The cloak was heavier than she expected, dense with quality, and it settled across her hands with the weight of something important. She was trying to refold it properly, to place it back on the chair without wrinkling the silk lining, when she heard the door behind her open. She did not have time to turn around before the voice hit her. It was not a loud voice. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had heard nobles shout before, had heard the echo of authority fill corridors like a physical force. But this voice was controlled, low, and somehow more dangerous for its quietness. So she said nothing. She turned slowly. The man in the doorway was tall, dark-haired. Perhaps 30 or 31 years old, though there was something in the set of his jaw and the sharpness of his gray eyes that made him seem both younger and far older simultaneously. He wore a riding jacket, unbuttoned at the collar, and there was dust from the road still on his boots. He had clearly arrived ahead of schedule, slipping past the prepared welcome and coming directly to his chamber. He was staring at her. Not at the cloak in her hands. At her face. She realized she had been holding his gaze far longer than a maid was supposed to. She dropped her eyes immediately. "Ilara Voss," she said. "Junior chambermaid, East Wing, 3rd floor." She paused. "I believe I was sent to the wrong room." His name was Caspian Aldermere. She did not say that. She already knew it because everyone in the castle knew it, the way everyone in a kingdom eventually knows the shape of the man who holds the northern territories in one hand and a century of political power in the other. He did not move from the doorway. "What are you holding?" he asked. She looked down at the cloak in her hands. The words came out carefully, as though she was stepping across ice. "Your cloak fell from the chair," she told him. "I picked it up." For a moment, nothing happened. Then he crossed the room toward her and she forced herself not to step back. He stopped at a distance that was not close enough to be threatening but was certainly close enough to be deliberate. He held out his hand. She placed the cloak in his palm. His fingers closed around the fabric, and for just a fraction of a second, his eyes moved from the cloak back to her face with an expression she could not read. It was not anger. It was not amusement. It was something more unsettled than either. "You were told not to enter this room," he said. "I was given a wrong room number," Alara replied. "I was not told anything about this room specifically." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but something that was at least adjacent to it. "A wrong number," he repeated. "One digit," she said. 61 instead of 16. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Go," he said. She went. But as she stepped into the corridor, she heard him say one more thing behind her, quiet enough that she was not entirely sure she was meant to hear it. "You folded it wrong," he said. "The silk faces inward." She stopped walking. She did not turn around. But despite everything, despite the racing of her heart and the cold sweat at the back of her neck, she felt the corner of her mouth move. She kept walking. Outside in the corridor, the guard had returned to his post. He stared at her with an expression of pure horror. "That is the Duke's private chamber," he whispered. She already knew that now. He warned her then, his voice dropping into something between a command and a prayer. "Touch nothing in there. Ever. Not a letter. Not a book. Not so much as a candle." She looked at the guard. She thought of the cloak in her hands, the weight of it, the way Caspian Aldermere had looked at her not as a maid but as something he had not expected to encounter. "I only picked up his cloak," she said. The guard looked at her as if she had just told him she had accidentally stepped on the king's crown. What dukes do not do. Caspian Aldermere was not a man who repeated himself. He had said go and she had gone, and that should have been the end of it. A maid with a wrong room number. A cloak on the floor. A coincidence so minor it barely registered against the weight of everything else pressing on him that October. He had arrived at Aldermere Castle early specifically to avoid ceremony. The formal welcome, the assembled household staff, the dinner that had already been arranged with Lord Fenwick and his insufferable habit of steering every conversation toward his daughter Mirabelle, who everyone in the kingdom apparently agreed would make a suitable duchess. Caspian had no interest in Mirabelle Fenwick. He had no interest in any of the carefully curated candidates that his advisers and his mother and the entire machinery of aristocratic expectation kept rotating past him like candidates at an audition he had never agreed to attend. He was 30 years old, unmarried, powerful enough that his unmarried state had become a political problem in itself. The Northern Territories required an heir. The estate required continuity. The king had made pointed remarks at the last council meeting that were not subtle enough to be called hints. Caspian understood all of this. He simply did not care about any of it at the moment. He sat at his writing desk, the cloak folded correctly now and placed over the back of the chair, and he tried to focus on the letters that had accumulated during his journey from the northern estate. There were land disputes to review. A trade agreement with the eastern merchants that required his signature. A report from his estate manager about the flooding along the Carron River that had damaged 2 villages' worth of crops. He read the same paragraph 4 times. The problem, which he would not have admitted to a living soul, was that he kept returning to the look on her face when he said you folded it wrong. She had not apologized again. She had not flustered or stumbled or done any of the things he had come to expect from the castle staff whenever he appeared unexpectedly. She had simply stopped walking, remained still for a moment, and then continued on her way with a composure that was frankly remarkable for someone who had just been discovered alone in the private chamber of the Duke of the Northern Territories holding his personal property. He did not know her name. He had not asked. He told himself this was because it did not matter. He was not entirely sure he believed himself. That evening, he attended the dinner with Lord Fenwick because there was no graceful way to avoid it. The dining hall was restored to its formal arrangement, candles lit along the length of the oak table, and the household staff moved in their quiet professional procession around the perimeter of the room. He was watching the conversation between Fenwick and his own estate steward, half listening, when he noticed one of the maids placing a decanter near the end of the table. It was her. She was in formal service dress now, the dark uniform of Aldermere's household staff, her brown hair pinned back properly. She was carrying herself with the same composure he had observed that morning, efficient and precise, and she gave no indication that she had noticed him noticing her. Which she almost certainly had. Fenwick was saying something about the grain prices in the East, and Caspian made the appropriate sounds of agreement while watching Alara Voss place the decanter exactly 2 inches from the center of the setting as though she had measured it, and then stepped back without ever once glancing in his direction. It was the not glancing that interested him. Every other person in the room glanced at him. Servants and nobility alike, they checked their movements against his attention, adjusted themselves to his presence in the room. It was one of the things he had long since stopped noticing because it had become as constant as weather. She did not do it. He excused himself from the dinner earlier than expected, citing the weariness of travel, and walked the corridor back to his chamber in the kind of mood that had no clean name. Not restless exactly. Not troubled. Something in between. The next morning he asked his estate steward, a competent and loyal man named Aldous, a single question. "The junior chambermaid who was misdirected to my chamber yesterday," he said. "Ilara Voss. What is her history here?" Aldous looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who was very carefully choosing his next words. "For years at Aldermere Castle," he said. "Excellent record. No disciplinary notes. Originally from Haverstone. Her father is Ren Voss, the blacksmith." Caspian considered this. "Does she have other duties beyond the East Wing?" Aldous paused again, longer this time. "Not currently," he said. "Though she has been informally helping in the castle library when the regular cataloguer has been ill. She apparently has some familiarity with organization and letters." Caspian turned back to the window. The northern hills were gray with morning cloud, the kind of sky that promised neither rain nor sun, just a suspended stillness that he had always associated with decisions not yet made. "Reassign her," he said finally. "To the general castle staff rotation rather than the East Wing specifically. I may require assistance in the library during my stay." Aldous was quiet for precisely long enough to communicate everything he wanted to say without saying any of it. "As you wish," he said. That was all. Caspian turned back to the window and told himself again that this was because of practical considerations. He was reviewing historical land records during this visit, and the library organization was known to be in a state of particular disorder. He needed someone competent who would not chatter or fawn. A maid with a wrong room number and correct posture and no apparent inclination to treat him as though his attention was a prize would do perfectly well. He was still watching the gray northern sky when he heard, from somewhere below in the castle courtyard, the distinct sound of a carriage arriving. Mirabelle Fenwick had come with her father after all. He closed his eyes briefly. This was going to be considerably more complicated than a wrong room number. Ilara received her reassignment from Mrs. Hartwell at mid-morning with an expression she had practiced for years. Still face. Open eyes. No visible reaction to anything. Inside, she was considerably less still. The library. The general rotation. During the Duke's stay, Mrs. Hartwell's voice had carried that particular quality it always had when delivering news that Mrs. Hartwell herself found peculiar but was too professional to question openly. She had looked at Ilara for just a fraction of a second too long before returning to her ledger and moving on to the next assignment. Ilara walked to the library and began her work without allowing herself to think about why she had been reassigned. The library on the fourth floor was a long, vaulted room with shelves built into the stone walls from floor to ceiling and narrow windows that filtered the northern light into something almost amber. It smelled of dust and old binding glue and the particular mustiness of pages that had not been turned in too long. An entire shelf of what appeared to be estate account books from the previous century had been placed horizontally instead of vertically, and several were at risk of warping. She set her cleaning materials aside. She began with the account books. She had been working for perhaps 2 hours, had reshelved an entire section and begun a rough ordering system based on date and subject, when she heard the door of the library open. She did not turn around immediately. She was in the middle of aligning a shelf and she finished what she was doing first. When she did turn around, Caspian Aldermere was standing just inside the doorway. He was dressed more formally than the day before, though still with that particular quality she had noticed, that his clothing looked like something he had chosen for function rather than performance. Dark jacket. No ornamentation beyond the ring on his right hand that bore the Aldermere seal. He looked at the shelf she had just reorganized. Then at her. "You have been here 2 hours," he said. She had not checked the clock. She did not ask how he knew. "The account books were at risk of warping," she replied. He crossed to the shelf and examined her organization system. His fingers traced the spines of the volumes and she watched him absorb the logic of it without asking her to explain it. That was interesting. Most people, in her experience, when confronted with an organizational system they had not created, asked for an explanation before they had looked carefully enough to understand it. He understood it without asking. "You have dated them by opening entry rather than closing," he said. "The closing dates are often incomplete," she replied. "The opening dates are always present." He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved past her to the far end of the library and began reviewing a section she had not yet reached. He pulled a rolled map from the shelf, examined it briefly, and placed it back. "There are land survey records from the 1740s somewhere in this room," he said. "They are relevant to a dispute I am currently reviewing." The previous filing made no logical sense. "I have not reached that section yet," she said. "But if you describe what you need specifically, I can look for the relevant markers." He turned to look at her. "Markers," he repeated. "Survey records from that period used a notation system," she said. "Red marker for disputed territory. Blue for settled boundary. If the records are here they will be labeled by both the survey date and the marker code on the spine or the rolled edge." He was very still. "How do you know that?" he said. "My father surveyed village boundaries as part of his work in Haverstone," she replied. "He kept records. I helped him organize them when I was young." This was true. It was also more personal information than she had shared with anyone at Aldermere Castle in 4 years. She was not entirely sure why she had said it. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched past what was comfortable and into something else entirely. Something that had no clean name. Then he crossed to the section of the library she had not yet reached and began pulling rolled documents from the shelves. "Help me find them," he said. She helped him find them. They worked in silence for the next 2 hours, side by side, periodically wordless in the way that people are when the task at hand is absorbing enough to make conversation unnecessary. She found the survey records in a rolled bundle behind a stack of estate correspondence, identified by the faded blue marker notation on the outer edge. She unrolled the first one carefully on the reading table, holding the edges down with the small stone weights she found in the drawer beneath the table. He leaned over the map. She stepped back. He glanced at her sideways. "You can look," he said. "You found them." She leaned over the opposite side of the table. The map was detailed and faded at the edges, the kind of document that had survived by being stored rather than used. The survey lines were precise and the disputed territory he was reviewing was marked clearly in faded red along the northeastern edge of what she recognized as the Carron River Valley. "There is an annotation in the margin," she said. She pointed without touching the document. "The notation system your estate staff is using currently does not match the original. Someone has changed the reference codes at some point between then and now." He looked at where she was pointing. His expression shifted. Something between recognition and frustration. "That explains 3 years of confusion," he said quietly. Almost to himself. She said nothing. After a moment he looked up at her from across the table. "Your name," he said. "It is Alara." "It is," she replied. He held her gaze again. "Alara," he said, as though he was testing the sound of it. She was a person who had spent 4 years being invisible. Who had learned to fold herself into walls and corridors and the rhythm of work. Who had built her survival in this castle on the principle of diligence and discretion above everything else. But when Caspian Aldermere said her name in the amber light of the library with the old survey map spread between them and the northern hills grey outside the narrow windows, something in the structure of Invisible shifted. She did not name it. But she felt it move. If this story is pulling you in, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications because stories like this one, full of forbidden glances and power and the kind of love that breaks all the rules, are what we do here. Do not miss a single one. Now back to Alara and the Duke. The cost of being seen. The visit was supposed to last 5 days. By the 3rd day, Alara had reorganized 2 full sections of the library, located 4 separate sets of historical records that Caspian's legal team had been unable to find for months, and developed the unsettling awareness that she was in serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble that came from entering the wrong room. That kind of trouble she knew how to manage. She had navigated it through composure and correct answers and the practiced art of being useful without being remarkable. The trouble she was in now was different. It was the kind that built quietly, in afternoon silences over old maps, in the particular way a very powerful man listened when she spoke, not with patience exactly but with a focused attention that felt nothing like condescension. In the way he remembered, without being reminded, that she preferred the stone weights on the left side of a document because her right hand was the one that pointed. Small things. Terrible things, in their accumulation. On the morning of the third day, everything became more complicated. Mirabelle Fenwick arrived in the library. She was 20 years old, golden-haired and perfectly turned out in a rose-colored gown that had been chosen, Elara suspected, with considerable care. She was beautiful in the way that women are beautiful when beauty has been cultivated as a skill. And she was not cruel, Elara noted. That would have been easier. She was simply intensely aware of what she wanted and professionally pleasant about pursuing it. What she wanted was Caspian Aldermere. Elara was on the upper gallery of the library, reshelving a set of correspondence files, when Mirabelle entered with her companion and settled herself at the reading table below with a book she almost certainly did not intend to read. When Caspian arrived 20 minutes later and found Mirabelle in the library, his expression was the kind that revealed nothing except to someone who had been watching it for 3 days. Elara had been watching it for 3 days. She kept working. Below her, Mirabelle was engaging Caspian with the practiced ease of someone who had been trained from childhood in the art of making conversation feel effortless. The Duke's responses were courteous and brief. He sat down at the far end of the reading table and opened the land records he had come to review. After a while, Mirabelle glanced up toward the gallery. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice carrying in the vaulted room. Caspian did not look up from the records. "The junior librarian assistant," he said. "She has been cataloguing." "She is a maid," Mirabelle said. Her voice was not unkind, merely precise. "A maid doing library work." "She is competent," Caspian replied, in the tone that Elara had already learned meant that the subject was closed. But Mirabelle was 20 years old and very confident in her position. "It seems an unusual arrangement," she said pleasantly. "Having a maid work alongside you in your private library." Caspian finally looked up. He did not look at Mirabelle. He looked directly up at the gallery where Elara was standing with a correspondence file in her hands. His expression was unreadable. But his eyes stayed on her for exactly long enough to communicate something she had no language for yet. Then he looked at Mirabelle. "I find it efficient," he said simply. And he returned to his records. Mirabelle smiled with the patience of someone revising their strategy rather than abandoning it. Elara shelved the correspondence file and moved to the next section. That evening, returning to the staff quarters, she was stopped in the back corridor by a woman named Petra, one of the senior maids, who had been at Aldermere for 15 years and had the institutional knowledge of a cathedral. "Be careful," Petra said quietly, with no preamble. Elara looked at her. "He notices you," Petra said. "Anyone in the castle with eyes can see it. And Fenwick has not brought his daughter here for a library visit." Elara kept her voice level. "I am doing my assigned work," she said. Petra looked at her with something that was not unkind. "That is not what I am warning you about," she said. She walked away. Elara stood in the back corridor for a moment in the dark, listening to the distant sound of the formal dinner beginning in the hall below. She had spent 4 years being careful. She had spent 4 years not being seen. The problem was not that Caspian Aldermere was noticing her. The problem was that she had, somewhere between the wrong room and the survey maps and the amber light of the library, entirely stopped wanting to be invisible. The following afternoon, she was alone in the library when he came in earlier than usual. She heard the door and did not turn around because she was in the middle of carefully unrolling a large survey document that required both hands to manage. She heard him cross the room. She heard him stop behind her. "You are going to drop the left edge," he said. She was not going to drop the left edge. But before she could say so, his hands came to the left side of the document, steadying it, and she was suddenly and acutely aware of exactly how close he was standing. Close enough that she could hear him breathe. Close enough that if she turned around, the distance between them would be nothing at all. She did not turn around. She placed the stone weights carefully on the right side. He placed weights on the left. They both stepped back from the document simultaneously, and she turned and he was right there, exactly as close as she had known he would be, and for a moment neither of them moved. She had gray eyes, darker than his, closer to the color of the northern hills in rain. He was looking at them as though he had only just noticed. "This is not appropriate," she said. He said nothing. "I am a maid," she continued. "And you are the Duke of the Northern Territories, and there is a woman downstairs who has been brought here specifically to become your wife." He held her gaze. "I am aware of all of that," he said. "Then you understand why I am going to step back now," she said. He did not move to stop her. But as she stepped back, he said her name. "Elara." She stopped. He did not say anything else. He just stood there with the old map on the table between them and the gray northern light coming through the narrow windows, and he said her name like it was the only thing in the room that mattered. She left the library. She walked directly to Mrs. Hartwell's office and asked to be reassigned to the East Wing immediately for personal reasons, and stood with her hands folded and her face still and her heart entirely uncooperative until Mrs. Hartwell agreed. She told herself this was the right decision. She was diligent. She was discreet. She was a maid with a wrong room number who had picked up a cloak and been foolish enough to stay too long in rooms that were never meant for her. She told herself all of this in very firm terms. And then she went to her small room in the staff quarters and sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark and acknowledged, finally, what Petra had seen and what she had been refusing to name for 3 days. She was in love with a duke who was not hers to love, in a castle where the wrong door had already changed everything, in a world where the distance between a blacksmith's daughter and the Northern Territories was not measured in miles but in 100 years of history and silk and power and the terrible, immovable mathematics of class. She was in very serious trouble indeed. In the upper library, Caspian stood at the reading table for a long time after she left. The old survey map was still spread before him. The stone weights were where they had placed them together. The left side, his. The right side, hers. He was a man who had learned very young that power was cleaner than feeling. Power had edges. Feeling did not. He had organized his life along those edges with the same precision that he brought to land disputes and trade agreements and the careful governance of 200,000 acres of Northern Territory. He had never been particularly bothered by this arrangement. Until a maid with a wrong room number had picked up his cloak from the floor and looked him directly in the eyes and told him she had been given the incorrect room number with the composure of someone who was completely unafraid of him. He had not been unafraid of himself since. He rolled the survey map carefully and placed it back in its labeled position on the shelf. He left the library. He went downstairs to the dinner that Fenwick had arranged and sat across from Mirabelle and was everything he was supposed to be. Courteous. Engaged. Appropriate. But all evening, through every careful, correct, expected moment of it, he was thinking about stone weights on opposite sides of a document and the particular gray of eyes that had looked at him as though they saw him rather than the Duke. He had said her name to make her stop. She had stopped. And then she had walked away, which was the correct thing to do, the sensible thing, the thing that made every kind of sense. He had never been so unwilling to accept what made sense in his entire life. Subscribe now. That is where we leave Alara and Caspian for today. A wrong door. A fallen cloak. A love that has no clean place to exist and no way of being undone. If this story reached something inside you, then do not leave without subscribing to this channel. Click that subscribe button right now and hit the bell so the next story finds you the moment it arrives. Stories like this one live and die by the people who stay. Stay. And come back for what happens when a duke decides that sensible has no power over him anymore.